Let's look at some of the Part 1 examples. First question asks, how many ways can each quadrilateral be classified? To do that, let's come up with a list of all the different possible names. Now this first one, A here, we can see that we have a pair of sides that are parallel, but the other side is not. And whenever we have a pair of parallel sides, that is going to be some form of trapezoid. If we look at the non-parallel sides here, and we look a little bit closer here, we see that it's across 4 up 2, and that's true on both sides. So these two ends are actually the same length. So that means that if we gave it the most specific name possible, we would call it an isosceles trapezoid. Now an isosceles trapezoid, if you want to give it a less specific name, you could also call it just a trapezoid. Or finally, a quadrilateral would be the least specific name you can give it. So there's 3 different names here. For B, we see that we have opposite sides that appear to be the same length and parallel. We have another set of sides here. All 4 of them actually appear to be about the same length. If we look closer, although this grid isn't totally drawn perfectly, we go over about 3 units and up about 4 units on the side. Same thing this direction, we go over about 2, 3 units, up about 4 units, and that's true on top as well. So each of those is approximately the same length. So we're going to say that this has 4 equal sides, and it would be called a rhombus if we gave it its most specific name. Now, thinking to less specific names than rhombus, if we were to go back up our tree here, we could call it a parallelogram, because we do have an opposite set of sides that are the same length. We have an opposite set of sides that are parallel. So we could call this a parallelogram, and that's my shorthand again for parallelogram, these being the parallel symbols. And we could call it a quadrilateral. Third one, we have what appears to be a rectangle. We see 4 right angles, which is what makes it a rectangle. Now we know that a rectangle is also going to be a parallelogram, and a parallelogram is also going to be a quadrilateral. So far all of these have 3 names. And then this last one here, I see a right angle, which means that these must be parallel, and it looks like we have a trapezoid, 1 set of parallel sides. Now we can't say that it is an isosceles trapezoid because of the fact that we don't have 2 equal length sides like we did in A. So this one would just be a trapezoid or a quadrilateral. So fewer options on this one. Now another type of problem that we're going to run into is sometimes, always, or never. So one of the hints that I always like to think about for sometimes, always, never questions is try to prove that it is both possible and yet possible to not be. So look for example and counterexample. And the reason you look for both is if you can find both, you have a guaranteed sometimes. So I might even risk write sometimes. If you can find a time where it is true and a time where it is false, you have proven that it must be sometimes. Now if you can only find an answer that is true, you haven't proven that it is always true, but at least it will help convince you that that might be right. Second thing I always recommend is draw a picture. Draw a picture. and we're going to cross that out. Those are the two things I always do whenever I do these types of problems. So let's try for the first one. A square is a rectangle. Let's draw a square. Let's start out for an example. A square, there's my square, that is also a rectangle. Does my square have 4 right angles? Yes, it does. So it is a rectangle. So it is not going to be never. It's either going to have to be always or sometimes, because I have an example of it working. So it can't be never. If I were to try to draw a different square that didn't have right angles, I'm going to run into a lot of trouble. So in fact, a square is always going to be also a rectangle. Second one, a rectangle is a trapezoid. A rectangle is a trapezoid. Now, honestly, this question depends on what country you're in, which sounds a little mind-blowing that anyone would change the definition based on what country they're in. But in the United States, a trapezoid is most commonly defined in most math textbooks as a shape with exactly one pair of parallel sides. In some countries, in some textbooks, they will say it is at least one pair of parallel sides. So depending on how it's defined, it's either always going to be true in some of the European countries. In America, though, if we're going to be supporting the US of A, it needs exactly one pair of parallel sides. And a rectangle is always going to have 2 sets of parallel sides. So it is never going to work. Last one, a quadrilateral is a kite. Well, I can draw myself a quadrilateral that is not a kite. So I got my never case checked off. I can draw a 4-sided shape, a quadrilateral, that is a kite. So I've got my positive case checked off, which means the answer has to be sometimes.